Hello, and welcome to Agati Video Podcast. This is a space where we host conversations with architects, designers, and different industry thought leaders to help educate you in your work. My name is Joe Agati, and I'm the CEO and Director of Design here at Agati Furniture. For our second episode today, we have Bill Browning, one of the founders of Terrapin Bright Green and a foremost thinker of green building design, as well as an advocate for sustainable design solutions at all levels of business, society, and government. Bill and I have had the opportunity to collaborate together on webinars in the past, so it's such a great honor to have him here today. Welcome, Bill. How are things going?
Things are good. We're busy. Lots of interest in biophilic design, which is always great to see.
Obviously, we're going to spend some time talking about biophilia and design. Before we do that, I wanted to get a little background on Terrapin Bright Green.
Terrapin is a small research and consulting firm working in the green building space. Our focus is really on three areas. High performance green buildings. We're kind of known, if you've got the weird complex project, you bring it to Terrapin. Experiential design, which is largely where our focus in biophilia sits. And then innovation inspired by nature. So biomimetic design.
Can you tell me where the name Terrapin actually comes from?
Long story, but so part of my ancestry is Haudenosaunee, Mohawk people. And how the Iroquois people came to this place is that first woman and first man lived in the clouds. And one day they were having an argument and he got really pissed off and pushed over a tree. And it ripped open a hole in the crown and she fell. And as she's falling to the water below, various animals are trying to figure out what to do so she doesn't drown. And the birds and the insects are slowing her descent, holding her up, while the other animals figure out what to do. And Beaver brings sticks, but unfortunately the sticks float away. And so eventually they talk to Turtle, and Turtle says Turtle can help. And so they start piling dirt on Turtle's back. And as Turtle raises to the surface, Turtle becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, becomes Turtle Island, North America. In the Algonquin language, the word for turtle is terrapin.
Interesting. I would like to say that our company name has such a great background. I think it was more based on egoism than anything else.
And names are always great. No, it's a family company.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. What experiences have led you here to, kind of on your path to getting here today?
My undergraduate work in college at the University of Colorado was in environmental design. And when I graduated, I moved up to Snowmass, Colorado to work for a place called WinStar Foundation. WinStar was John Denver's environmental foundation, a 1,000-acre site with a 1950s mid-century modern ranch house that had been converted into a solar demonstration center. I was there to build what was the next generation beyond standard geodesic domes into what's called a deresonated tensegrity. And so started at WinStar, and then about 3.5 years later moved across the street to Rocky Mountain Institute, where I initially worked doing ag research and then community economic development. We were increasingly talking with architects and building owners about what became known as green building. And I realized that with a degree in design, I could talk with architects, but I knew nothing about real estate finance or how you got it built and all of that. And so I took a break, went back to school, got a degree in real estate development at MIT, and then came back in 1991. We founded Green Development Services, which was one of the first green building consulting practices. So
usually when I bring up biophilia, it's always followed by, oh, do you know Bill Browning? Have you read his stuff? So your name gets very much associated with biophilia. So let me ask you, how did you, first get involved in the ideas of biophilia, and the different patterns? And
I'd like to say it was intentional, but it wasn't. We were collecting case studies for two different books at Rocky Mountain Institute. One was on energy efficiency and industrial productivity. And the other was a book that eventually called Green Development, that was looking at early green real estate projects. And while we had two different teams doing the collection, and both teams started finding examples of really increased productivity in these places. Higher sales per square foot, drops in defect rates, lower absenteeism in commercial buildings, and we couldn't find anything in the literature about this. At the time, everyone was trapped in the old Hawthorne mindset that at the Western Electric plant in Cicero, Illinois, the Hawthorne plant, one of the things they were doing was making relay switches. And that was a time-based task. You know how many switches were being produced per hour. And so they decided to do a study of changing things and seeing how that impacted the work conditions. And so the way the study is taught is they came in and they raised the lighting level and productivity went up. They came back a little later, and once again, they raised the lighting level and productivity went up. And then as a control, they came back a little bit later and lowered the lighting level, and productivity went up. So the conclusion the way it's taught is that changes in the workplace environment are not significant, other than that they signal management's concern for workers. And that's how you manage the people is more important than the building, is what people take away from that. And here we're sitting with these case studies that say, well, there were no management changes in any of these buildings. And in fact, one of the case studies where we published it for the first time was a postal sorting facility where they had done a lighting retrofit that so improved people's ability to see the pieces of mail. The number of pieces of mail sorted per hour went up dramatically. And we had to struggle for quite a while to get permission to be able to publish that, not because they didn't believe the data and the data wasn't solid, but because they hadn't changed how they manage the people. And as you know, the only way that a manager can take credit for gains in productivity is by how they change managing their people. So after a bunch of conversations, we eventually got them to agree that changing the building required a management decision, and therefore they could take credit for it, and we got permission to publish the study. So what we did find out subsequently about Hawthorne was that Hawthorne did actually take place. But it wasn't just lighting. They changed all sorts of stuff. They changed break periods. They changed all sorts of different working conditions. They gave them breaks every 15 minutes and they couldn't get anything done. They gave them no breaks, and pretty much other than those two, almost every experiment that they did over the course of the period, which was interestingly, was right in the middle of the Great Depression, good time to study worker motivation. Pretty much every change they made led to a gain in productivity. So when you see that, you would say, okay, the conclusion that the conclusion that you hear makes sense, until you discover some issues with the experiment. So the way they set it up was they had the plant average production numbers, and they set up a separate workroom, and they put 5 workers and their supervisors in that room. And they conducted those experiments, and the way they kept track of productivity was every time someone finished a relay, it got dropped down a chute, and at the bottom of the chute was a flapper switch that triggered an electric paper punch that kept tally of the production rate, and was in the same room with the workers and the supervisors. And the workers and the supervisors, for agreeing to take part in the experiment, got a bonus anytime their production rate was higher than the plant average. And anytime they were slow, they said, oh, we need to speed up so we can get our bonus. And so you wind up with that as your actual experiment. But you have this mindset that it's management and not the space itself. We know that management is stunningly important. And additionally, the space itself is really, really, really important. Mm-hmm. So after we published Greening the Building Bottom Line in 1995, my co-author, Joe Rome, moved to the Department of Energy. He was one of the heads of finance for a portion of DOE in the Clinton administration, and was able to set aside some money for doing a study of a brand new building that Herman Miller had just built as a factory with Bill McDonough, day-lit, beautiful connection with views out to a restored prairie landscape that surrounded the building, and 700 people working in 3 shifts, moving from a windowless box into this. So perfect place to do a productivity study. Mm-hmm. And so run by federal labs, and one of the 3 primary researchers on the project, an environmental psychologist named Judith Heerwagen. And Judith said, one of the operating hypotheses for the experiment was this idea of biophilia, that potentially the connection with nature that this thing would create would be beneficial. It actually played out better than we expected. When we first saw the data was really muddy, which was surprising. The overall, the metadata said, yes, there was a gain in productivity over the prior facility. But when you looked at it by shift, there was a huge gain in the daytime shift, mixed data in the swing shift, and no gain in productivity in the nighttime shift. The lighting levels were great in all shifts. Fantastic. The space was fantastic. But there was no view to the outside at night. And so suddenly we realized that this view to nature, it wasn't just daylighting, it wasn't just lighting conditions, it was the view and this connection to nature made a difference. So we just started collecting every paper we could find and categorizing it by, okay, so what's the experience of nature and how are people reacting? Mm-hmm. And we just kept collecting those and collecting those and collecting those. At that time, one of our folks moved to Yale to study with Stephen Kellert, who had done the book with E.O. Wilson, the Biophilia Hypothesis. That was a collection of papers on biophilia. And we got in an in-depth conversation, and so we helped Stephen put together a conference of bringing together researchers, scientists, and designers on biophilic design. And that happened in 2004. And then the results of that conference were published in 2008, the book Biophilic Design. Jen Seal-Kramer, who was my writing partner in this work at Rocky Mountain Institute, and I put together an essay. And in that, we introduced this concept of, we realized that combing through all the science and all the different proposed patterns and experiences that had been listed and that people had identified, we realized they kind of fit into 3 broad categories. First, we called nature and the space, which are direct experiences of nature. The second are natural analogs, which are representations of nature. Mm-hmm. And then the third was the spatial conditions themselves. That's where you see prospect and refuge and those conditions. Mm-hmm. After we started Terrapin in 2006 with Rick Cook and Bob Fox, biophilia was already an active conversation. It's something that everyone was interested in. We decided to take it a few steps further and start to, let's come up with a pattern language based on that. We were having conversations with clients, and sometimes the conversations were just them sort of nodding their head going, wow, that's really nice. And so Chris Garvin suggested that we do an exercise similar to what we've done at Rocky Mountain Institute on greening the building and bottom line. And so in 2012, we published The Economics of Biophilia to say that, this connection to nature isn't just nice, it has huge economic implications. And so that was, we did that. And while we were doing that, we were also working on putting together a pattern language. And our friend Mary Davidge was doing work with Google, had known us for years, and was really interested in this and said, we know you're developing a pattern language. Google's culture is if you don't have the science, you can't have the conversation. So they gave us funding to, we said, pick 2 or 3 of your proposed patterns and chase the science to ground. And then come back, propose a metric, and we'll send it out and get it peer reviewed. And we did that. And then eventually that led to us, along with a team of other folks, Stephen Keller and Judy Hirwag and Vivian Lofness, and the folks at Sarah Architects, developing a pattern language or a set of biophilic design guidelines that are now used for Google's spaces, buildings, and campuses worldwide.
It's a fascinating story. Kind of leads us to here. So just you kind of touched on this a lot. We were just talking about. So what is, I guess, how would you describe biophilia? And we talked about, I know you talked about some patterns. So what is biophilia and what are those patterns?
So the simplest definition, biophilia is an innate connection to nature. That's the definition that you see Ed Wilson use and comes in originally in his essay or his book, Biophilia. The term itself comes from the social psychologist Erich Fromm, and it literally is the combination of the 2 Greek words, bios, life, and philia, love. The working definition, this innate connection to nature, comes from Ed Wilson's work. And then biophilic design is design that intentionally connects people to experiences of nature. What we've learned is that we can kind of categorize the responses into 3 broad categories. Stress reduction, which we can measure through heart rate, blood pressure, galvanic skin testing, cortisol, the stress hormone, heart rate variability, a bunch of different ways of getting at that. Cognitive performance, improved cognitive performance, and there are lots of different tests you can give to gauge people's cognitive performance. And then finally, mood or preference. How does it impact us emotionally in our mood, and also what's called visual preference, or what is it that we like to look at, what gets our attention. And that's work done, a lot of that work now is done using eye tracking software. In design school, we had taught about the cone of vision, or in science, and as a kid, we get the cone of vision, right? And you see the things in the cone of vision. What we don't realize is that that's only telling us part of the information, because it takes so much brain power to process stuff. What we're actually looking at any given point is a window about yay big, right? And then the eye is darting around to fill in the details. And you can track those subconscious movements of the eye. And so you show someone an image for 3 or 4 seconds, and you wind up with a heat map of what in that image got their attention. If it's a human face, we'll go to that first. We are, we're a social critter, so we are totally focused on human faces. But then frequently, if it's something that's related to nature, we will go to that next. And so some work done by Jay Yin at Harvard, looking at setting people in a windowless classroom and then out in a hallway with surrounded by plants, a perforated screen with biomorphic forms in it, a view to the Charles River. That, no surprise, you got far better responses with the biophilic setting than in the windowless classroom. But Jay then replicated his experiment in VR. And at first I was a little horrified by that. And even more horrified by the fact that he got almost the same result.
Oh, wow.
But that then for us was really informative, because when we thought about it and backed up, they were sitting in the same chair in both experiments. either in the hallway or in the classroom. And so what they were touching, the haptic input was the same, the temperature was the same, the airflow was the same, what they were smelling, olfactory was the same, what they were hearing was the same. The variable then left behind was what they were seeing. And so to get almost the same response in VR means that we can now use VR to mock up spaces and see how people are responding using a variety of different systems to monitor their response, including eye tracking.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. Interesting. So you can then kind of model it out, and you can test different biophilia patterns and then gauge the response from somebody then.
Right. We've got one project that just one floor, the project's 400,000 square feet, and with ceilings 40 feet or higher. And that's a little too big to mock up. And so
be challenging.
One of the things we've thought through and wanted to explore with that is, let's go into the 3D models of the space, experience in VR, and see what, are they responding to the biophilic interventions? Because when you got 400,000 square feet, I can't put things everywhere. I just no budget to do that, right? So I got to figure where it's going to be most effective, and then that's one way we could potentially test it out.
Interesting. When I work with different architects, interior designers, and they bring up and they want to use different biophilic elements, a lot of people go towards plants as like a number one thing. That seems to be like, we want some biophilia in here. We're going to use plants, or we're going to use water features. And as you know, like in our approach to design, with furniture, we use a lot of the principles of prospect and refuge to try to create, feeling of comfort for people. In your kind of experience, what works well? Is it trying to incorporate every pattern you can, or is it really identifying the patterns that you can incorporate effectively? I guess what's a good way to approach, or how would you advise people to kind of approach that?
So it's several steps. The first would be identify who your users are, right? And how do you think they're going to use the space? What's the day in the life of their experience of that space?
Yeah.
Where do they need support on stress reduction? Where is cognitive performance important? So, figure out what those issues are that you want to support. Because we know that when you look at the patterns and look at the science, not all the patterns support all those outcomes. So you'll see in our publication, 14 Patterns of Biophilic Design, and in our new book, Nature Inside, charts that are the patterns and then outcomes in the science to support that. We say, okay, so let's look at that and use that as a filter for thinking through which patterns might be appropriate for that space. Because, remembering 15 at any one time, and one of the folks who wrote it, and it's like, oh yeah, which one? Oh yeah, that one. So the most effective spaces usually highlight one or two patterns. People will default to plants and water, both of which are incredibly effective. If I'm going to do plants, I want you to do a biodiversity of plants that, in effect, trick the mind to saying, oh, look, there's a habitat here, so this must be a good place for me to be. Water features are incredibly powerful. We have a really strong affiliation to water, including water sound. So one of the pieces of work we've done is a paper called An Ear for Nature, which is on psychoacoustics. In particular, we were looking at the difference between acoustics, which is how sound moves around in a space and comes to your ear, which is incredibly important, and then what the brain actually chooses to listen to. To explain that, might be easier to explain that by thinking about a busy bar or cocktail party, which hopefully soon we'll all be able to experience again.
Let's hope.
What you don't realize is that every conversation in that room is coming into your ear. You're hearing every one of those conversations. But I can't filter, I can't process all of those, right?
Yeah.
So the brain is choosing the conversation you're having with your friend and 0.6 of some other conversation. One of the things that looking at is masking sound in an office environment. What would be the most effective masking sound? And so worked on in Germany and in the UK in particular on this topic. White noise is the most effective from a acoustic standpoint, but actually water sound is by far the most effective in a psychoacoustic standpoint. In particular, if it's a sound of water like a little waterfall or a small stream. There's also been work on bird song. And in particular, if I've got a public space where I want to feel people to feel safer, bird song is by far the most effective sound to introduce into those environments.
Oh, interesting.
That also makes sense, right? If you walk through a forest and you're hearing all the birds singing and the birds suddenly stop, right? Right? Where's the bear? Where's the mountain lion, right?
That's right.
So going back to, what do I choose? We find that people will focus on plants and water and that visual connection to nature. And it makes sense that people will default to that. People frequently overlook the spatial patterns. Prospect and refuge are really, really important. And what we're finding, particularly in open plan office, you typically have usually pretty fantastic prospect. But I, from time to time, need that little withdraw, reprocess, quiet time, get away. I need my back protected, right? And I need at least the nape of my neck protected. That refuge experience is incredibly important. Create it with a small room, with an ingle nook, with a window seat, a high back wing chair, or one of the carrels that you guys designed with the curving carrel.
Yeah,
fantastic. In particular because unlike a normal carrel, my back's not exposed, right? I'm in that, and so I have a prospect view laterally, but I'm protected in that space. And so, it's a brilliant and really direct, simple way of doing it, created a really effective and, frankly, movable prospect and refuge experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, when you talk about prospects and refuge, something we've been trying to understand ourselves. And like I said before, we use those principles a lot when we're thinking about product and design. And I wanted to ask you, we've been struggling to try to explain where it's very easy to understand. You put somebody inside of a carrel, they feel comfortable versus having their back exposed. It's a very easy concept for someone to get. What we find is people will aggregate at a higher table closer together. When they go to a lower table, they're further apart. And, we attribute that to a prospect element. I can survey my environment. I feel a little more comfortable. I can have people closer to me. There's this kind of like in between where it's like almost like suggested refuge, where, if you kind of like draw like the four corners of a square, you can, and you see a square. Where we do is we'll cut like, kind of into a top. So, we have a top that kind of wraps around somebody, and we'll find that people will gravitate towards there. So they're not really getting the full refuge effect of like getting, having your back covered, but there's this kind of implied element. I was just wondering if have you kind of come across anything or experienced anything that would just kind of start to explain what's going on from a behavioral or a comfort standpoint?
The scalloped edge is interesting, particularly if the scallops are not directly across from each other, right? Particularly in a setting where I don't know that person sitting across from me. If they're sitting directly across from me, then I might be making eye contact with them. And I'm wanting to be on task. And so if I'm like this, then we're tending to respond directly to that person. And if I'm studying or doing work, I don't necessarily want that. Right? I want that to be intentional, not something that is a distraction or makes me feel uncomfortable, particularly if it's someone I don't know. So having that scalloping and offsetting then yeah, they're in our peripheral vision and we see the movement and all that, but we're not staring at their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
And so very, very, that's definitely a comfort issue. Right? It's a psychological comfort issue. Mm-hmm. Another spatial experience, a company that we know had created micro kitchens around their floor plates, where you could go get a snack. And the micro kitchens typically had a back wall that had a bunch of stuff on it, and then an island. And then on the island would be cutting blocks and the coffee machine and espresso machine and stuff like that. Stuff where you're doing an activity. And they're set up so that when you're at the island, you're facing into the room. Everyone thought it was, this is a really nice perk. You can go get your M&Ms, you can go get healthy snacks, right? You can go get your espresso, you can all that sort of stuff is great. The kitchen team came in and said, well, this is a really inefficient layout. And so they're like, we're going to move this piece of equipment and that piece of equipment to the back wall, right? Yeah, makes for a more efficient kitchen, but totally destroyed the entire reason for having those places, which wasn't about the food. It was about creating opportunities for chance interactions. If I'm doing a task and I'm standing looking out into the room, someone can walk up to the side of me or in front of me and engage me. If I'm staring at the back wall and doing that same task and looking at the wall, it's really uncomfortable for someone to walk up to me and try to engage me in conversation. Mm-hmm. Now those chance interactions are now greatly diminished. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, think about the implications of how we interact and how the design facilitates or affords us those experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and me, I'm more visceral in my work, especially when it comes to product design. And so, yeah, there's definitely, I can kind of sympathize and understand that kind of like dynamic of what you'd call like the chance interaction. I think that's where a lot of, from a product and design and development standpoint, that's where a lot of kind of you take leaps forward. And I think people maybe sometimes underestimate that, say, well, like that's kind of a creative type environment. I always counter with people. I'm like, well, why does, putting pen to paper and creating being able to draw some 3-dimensional object on a 2-dimensional media make you creative? I would argue my sister, she has a background in econ and analytics. She's highly creative when you get to talking to her about she'll analyze something and use this spreadsheet and then they go look at this data. And it's just like, it's interesting. You're like, wow, and so I think some of these, like you're saying, these things get overlooked and then, saying, well, it's really for this, but not really understanding how it can really actually impact the entire kind of community.
Yeah, well, and also when you've got, cultures in these tech firms that are full of people doing coding all day long. Mm-hmm. You know the old joke about how do you tell your coder is an extrovert? They look at your shoes when they talk to you. Being a strong extrovert, I totally get that one. Yeah. I'm not the extrovert. I am totally the introvert. Yeah. So, how can we use biophilic design to create experiences that really enhance people's day and interactions and support the well-being of the space? One of the things we're also getting more interested in is even just the patterns of the surfaces and the materials of the surfaces. We're really, really getting interested in fractals. Okay. And collinear patterns. Mm-hmm. And materials that have that characteristic. We did an experiment led by an architect in Baltimore, Jim Detterman, with a 6th grade mathematics classroom at the Green Street Academy, which is an inner city STEM charter school. Mm-hmm. And we picked a 6th grade mathematics classroom, and the point was to do minimal interventions. So the building was originally built in 1925. It was renovated by Jim and his team to create this school. So a lot of the classrooms are an east-facing facade, high windows. The classroom we picked was on the second floor, with a view out to a garden and a field. But because they were on the east facade, they had Venetian blinds that, in the morning the sun is shining, streaming into the room, and so the Venetian blinds are typically closed on all those classrooms, and they never get opened. So even though there's a view and great daylight in all these classrooms, the Venetian blinds are always closed, which is really unfortunate. So we were thinking about what would be the minimal interventions we could do that were replicable, and so we wound up with carpet tiles, some wallpaper, some ceiling tiles, and modified window blinds. Those were the interventions. The two other interventions were a landscaping company decided to boost the view outside by increasing the plantings in the garden outside, flowering trees and some other stuff there. What we did was we made minimal interventions in the classroom and compared academic performance to prior years in that classroom with the same teacher teaching the same curriculum. And so we have these data sets from that classroom of students. And so prior year, we have, I think, 125 students in that year. And then our year, we had, I think, 122 students in the classroom. And what we see is, what were the interventions? So first was removing a lot of the posters from the wall. Now, that was really tough to do because teachers are obsessed on how much content they put on the walls. Mm-hmm. But what we learned from the neuroscience team at Salk is that that's overstimulating. That's actually counterproductive, particularly with mathematical formulas and all of that. And so that backup was to remove those and to get permission from the school administration and the school board that the teacher would not be negatively assessed. The agreement was to allow 3 at any given time to be up. On the floor, put in carpet tiles from Interface in a pattern that is like waving grass. It's called prairie grass. Mm-hmm. So that sets up a condition of collinear lines. And we know from the certain neuroscientists at Salk in particular have been doing that work, is that those sorts of patterns are much easier for the brain to process. We like them a lot. And so those sorts of biomorphic forms with collinear patterns or radial patterns, or those sorts of patterns that occur in nature, lower our stress level. That was the first intervention. Second intervention was then putting a frieze of wallpaper around the top of the classroom that had been designed in collaboration of the folks at Salk with designer Design Text. That's an abstraction of palm leaves. And so it creates both biomorphic forms and those collinear patterns in a somewhat fractal-like nature. Some waveform ceiling tiles in part of the ceiling. And then on the windows, remove the Venetian blinds and instead put Meko shades, which are automated fabric shades on the windows. And then on the Meko shades were silk screened what's called a statistical fractal. It's a kind of fractal pattern. The pattern that was used was tree branch shadows. And so that then produces a statistical fractal. And we also know from other teams that when we see those sorts of fractals in human-created objects, because they occur so commonly in nature, it's easier for the brain to process that. And in fact, the term that the neuroscientist uses is fractal fluency. The brain is fluent with those sorts of fractals. And again, we get a reduction in stress. So what we found in surveying the students and the teacher, the most common word they use to describe the classroom is calm. And you can see it in the video interviews with the students as they say, I felt calmer in this space. Mm-hmm. You see it in their academic performance. Their test scores The very first test at the very beginning of the year are almost exactly the same as the prior year, which is good because that then tells you we have a uniform baseline. But over the course of the year, their performance gets better and better and better. And so we see a really significantly improved academic performance among those students in that classroom over the prior year. We also wanted to do biometric testing. And we have 4 months of biometric testing data. We wanted to do a whole year, but getting permission to do biometric testing on 6th graders in a public school is challenging.
I'd imagine so.
Particularly because we also needed a control classroom. So that experiment was a 4-month experiment in that classroom, and then a control classroom, a 7th grade mathematics classroom, a couple doors down, using 1 period each week, the same period in early afternoon. The class is 90 minutes long, and so we have the students in that class in the 6th grade and in the 7th grade class in that period. And we used heart rate variability, which is a good way to look at stress recovery characteristics. And so what you are hoping to see is a number that changes over the course of the class. And what we saw in the 7th grade, the control classroom, was almost no change from beginning of class to end of class through the 4 months that the experiment went on. In the biophilic classroom, the numbers between beginning of class and end of class are improved dramatically. And so that tells us the experience of being in that class improves the biometrics for those children.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's when you talk about that, it kind of reminds me of you'd mentioned earlier one of our Carol products that we make, the pod. It's that round one. And I've always had a hard time explaining why, because we make a similar one that is more geometric. There's square versus round. We see that people will gravitate towards the round carols at a much greater rate than the square. And, I would attribute to, it's like, sitting in a big hug to some degree. But even so, when we see requests come from them, I want to know, the price, how they work, they most often reference, an image where it's 6 of them together in an S shape. And I've always kind of equated, I have a background in aviation. So, when I'm flying around, I get to fly at these lower levels and just get these beautiful views of landscapes. And it's very, very calming for me and very peaceful. But I always love flying kind of on the southeast and eastern coast because you have low mountains and you have these ravines and the river naturally winding through. And I've just kind of that's always reminded me of it. And it's just, and that's when you're kind of talking about that kind of just resonates with me. It's, it's our brain, it's kind of making this kind of connection with this formed object, but relating it to, a natural made object. And kind of that's what's creating that kind of maybe natural gravitation towards it.
Well, and that sinuous form is telling us the most efficient way to move material in water, right? And how, nature doesn't use straight lines that often. Nature always moves things in curves, right?
Yes.
And we respond to that. Amy Levins has this funny comment. He says, if God wanted us to be in boxes, she would have given us corners.
Yeah.
See any corners on you? No.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. We noticed that ourselves, that definitely the more kind of organic forms, they're just and it's always hard to explain. And when you're trying to work with somebody, you're trying to, put science behind it, but it's tricky because, you're trying to interpret how a brain works, and that's challenging. But I think, where I think a lot of people are kind of using biophilia and it's resonating with people is because it's bridging that gap, that the things we know but yet can't explain. And I think biophilia has been a really great way to kind of bridge it and explain kind of the things we know or feel.
So going back to when we were working with Steve Keller to put together the conference on biophilic design, we applied to a lot of different foundations to help support the research and put together the conference. And we got rejection after rejection after rejection. And my most favorite one that I wish I had kept and framed had a line in it that has stuck with me ever since. And that was, if we understand what you are requesting, you want us to fund research into the intuitively obvious. And Stephen and I, we got the letter, and Stephen and I have this phone call, and it's like, yes, that's exactly what we want you to do, right? I joke that a good portion of Terrapin's work and research is giving the science behind the intuitively obvious.
Interesting. Yeah. And I love that phrase, because for me, it's like, I feel like I am always in search of the why. Being a product designer and in my background, I first got involved in design because it's the beginning to understand why we do what we do, why things are the way they are. Everything had to be designed, whether it's from mechanical or even from nature. It all had to be designed on some level. And so, product design really resonated with me, because for me, it started to bridge that gap and started to like kind of satisfy that curiosity. Like, why are we here? What happened? Why did this end up this way? What's going on? And this compulsive obsession to understand and problem solve all at the same time.
We are somewhat oblivious, but we move through the day when everything around us, particularly because we're spending 90% of our time inside, everything around us was designed. Someone had to design it. And, there are a lot of times when it's like, who designed this? What were you thinking? It's
exactly.
A conscious, deliberate act. And yet we sometimes forget everything has to be designed.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. And whether it's from, human innovation or brute force of evolution, it's all designed on some level.
Right.
Bill, I really appreciate the time today. And just in closing, I wanted to ask you to impart some wisdom, words of wisdom on us. I always tell people that, you're full of these really great, interesting kind of like factoids and obviously insights. And so, we talked about the one being able to hear water from the furthest distance earlier. And so I was wondering if you could impart like a great piece of wisdom or factoid on us in closing.
So maybe my thought would be, get outside. Biophilic design is awesome, and it makes being inside better and helps us. But ultimately, I want to get people outside and in real nature.
Mm-hmm.
See it, smell it, taste it, touch it. Go out and get some portion of your life outside and really see the magic and the joy and the amazing characteristics of life around us.